Washington, D.C. is the capital of the most powerful country on earth. It's home to the White House, the U.S. Capitol, the Supreme Court. Some of the most influential people in the world make decisions here every single day. So here's a question. Why doesn't it have a skyline? Fly over almost any major American city and you'll immediately recognize it. New York reaches into the clouds. Chicago is filled with towering steel giants. Even cities you've probably never visited, places like Charlotte, Nashville, or Oklahoma City, have skyscrapers defining their skylines. But then there's Washington from above. It almost looks frozen in time. Block after block of stone buildings, wide avenues, historic monuments, and almost nothing rises above them. No glass towers. No forest of skyscrapers, nothing. At first you might assume it's because the city sits on unstable ground. It doesn't. Maybe it's because airplanes fly too close to the city. That's not the reason either. Or perhaps the government simply wanted the skyline to look beautiful. Again, wrong. In fact, millions of Americans believe they already know the answer. You've probably heard it before. No building is allowed to be taller than the Washington Monument. It sounds believable. It's repeated everywhere, and it's completely false. The real reason is stranger. Far stranger. More than 130 years ago, a single apartment building changed Washington forever. Not a skyscraper. Not a massive tower, just 12 floors. One building became so controversial that Congress stepped in and changed the future of the entire city. And the law they created still controls Washington's skyline today. But before we get to that building, you need to understand something unusual about this city. Because Washington wasn't designed to compete with New York. It wasn't even designed to look like a normal American city. In fact, from the very beginning, its creators imagined something completely different. A capital that looked less like a commercial center and more like the capital of an empire. Wide ceremonial avenues, massive public squares, perfect sightlines stretching toward monuments. Buildings that symbolize government, not business. For decades, that vision worked perfectly. Then, in the late 1800s, America changed. Steel changed everything. Elevators changed everything. Suddenly, cities weren't growing outward anymore, they were growing upward. One after another, American skylines began reaching heights that had never been thought possible. And eventually, that revolution arrived in Washington. One architect looked at the future and decided the nation's capital should be part of it. He had no idea that his building would trigger one of the strangest laws in American history. The year was 1894. America was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. For centuries, buildings had one unavoidable limitation. The higher you built, the thicker the walls had to become. Eventually, gravity always won, but then came steel. Instead of relying on massive brick walls to support a building, engineers began constructing steel skeletons that carried the entire weight. Almost overnight, buildings became taller than ever before. Cities across America entered a race toward the sky. Chicago was leading it. New York quickly followed, and many believed Washington would be next. One man certainly did. His name was Thomas Franklin Schneider, a young architect with an ambitious vision. Just a year earlier, he had visited the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. There, he witnessed something extraordinary. Massive steel frame buildings. Modern elevators, architecture that seemed impossible only a generation before. To Schneider, this wasn't just the future, it was inevitable. So when he returned to Washington, he decided to bring that future home. His project would become known as the Cairo. Today, 12 stories doesn't sound impressive. Many hotels are taller. Apartment buildings twice that size exist in almost every major city. But in 1894, the Cairo was enormous, rising more than 160 feet above the streets of Washington. It instantly became the tallest residential building in the city. People couldn't stop looking at it. Some admired it, others were horrified, not because it was ugly, because they genuinely believed it might collapse. Remember, steel frame construction was still new. Very few people understood how it worked. To many residents, this giant building looked like an experiment, one that was being performed directly over their heads, and structural collapse wasn't their only fear. Fire terrified them even more. At the end of the 19th century, urban fires were among the deadliest disasters imaginable. Entire city blocks had burned to the ground before. Now imagine a fire 12 stories above the street. Washington's fire department simply wasn't prepared. Their ladders couldn't reach the upper floors. If people became trapped, there was almost nothing firefighters could do. For the first time, Washington wasn't arguing about architecture. It was arguing about safety. Newspapers began covering the controversy. Citizens demanded action. Public meetings grew increasingly heated. And before long, the debate reached the United States Congress. At first, lawmakers weren't discussing skyscrapers. They were discussing one building, one address, one architect, one experiment. But history has a strange habit. Sometimes, one building is all it takes to change an entire city forever. And that's exactly what happened, because Congress wasn't about to stop with the Cairo. Instead, it decided to make sure another Cairo could never be built again. Congress moved surprisingly fast. In 1899, lawmakers passed Washington's first Height of Buildings Act. At first glance, it seemed simple. Buildings would no longer be allowed to grow without limits. Maximum heights were established across the city. The immediate crisis appeared to be over. The Cairo had won the battle, but it had also lost the war. You might think that was the end of the story. It wasn't, because just 11 years later, Congress came back. And this time, it rewrote the rules completely. In 1910, lawmakers passed a new Height of Buildings Act. Remarkably, this is still the law that shapes Washington today. And here is where things become truly unusual. Most cities decide how tall buildings can be using fixed numbers. 200 feet, 300 feet, maybe taller in certain districts. Washington chose a completely different system. Instead of asking, how tall should this building be? The law asked, how wide is the street in front of it? That single question changed everything. Under the new law, a building's maximum height depended almost entirely on the width of the street it faced. A wider avenue allowed a taller building. A narrower street forced buildings to stay lower. In other words, the streets determined the skyline, not the architects, not the developers, not even the owners of the land. Imagine trying to build a skyscraper, only to discover that your biggest limitation isn't your budget or your engineering. It's the width of the sidewalk outside. That's exactly how Washington works. Even today, most commercial buildings are limited to around 130 feet. Residential neighborhoods are often restricted even further. Only a handful of locations receive slightly higher limits. But nowhere comes close to a modern skyscraper. The result is something almost no other major city has. Stand almost anywhere in downtown Washington, and the sky is still visible. Historic monuments dominate the horizon. Government buildings remain the visual center of the city. Developers have spent more than a century working around the law. Some buildings spread across entire city blocks instead of growing upward. Others disappear underground, adding multiple basement levels where height restrictions don't apply. Office buildings became wider, hotels became longer, architecture adapted. Because the law never did, more than 100 years later, Washington still looks remarkably similar from above. Not because technology stood still, not because developers lacked ambition, but because one law quietly decided the city would never race toward the sky. And yet, almost everyone still gets the reason wrong. Ask people why Washington has no skyscrapers, and you'll probably hear the same answer. It's because no building can be taller than the Washington Monument. It's one of the most widespread myths in America, and it's completely false. If you've ever wondered why Washington has no skyscrapers, there's a good chance you've already heard the explanation. Maybe from a teacher, a tour guide, a documentary, or simply someone repeating what they've always been told. It goes like this. No building in Washington is allowed to be taller than the Washington Monument. Sometimes people tell a different version. Nothing can be taller than the Capitol Dome. It's a great story. It sounds patriotic. It even feels like something Congress would do. There's just one problem. Neither of those rules actually exists. Not in the original law. Not in the updated law. Nowhere. In fact, the Height of Buildings Act never mentions the Washington Monument. Not once. It doesn't mention the Capitol Dome either. The law doesn't protect either landmark by name. Instead, it only talks about streets, street widths, building heights, and mathematical limits. That's it. So where did the myth come from? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because the law accidentally produced exactly that result. The Washington Monument stands over 550 feet tall. The Capitol Dome rises nearly 300 feet above the city. Meanwhile, the tallest buildings allowed under Washington zoning rules are only around 160 feet. They're not even close. The monument is more than 3 times taller. The Capitol easily towers above every surrounding building. So people naturally assumed that must have been the goal, but it wasn't. The Skyline wasn't designed around monuments. The monuments simply benefited from a law written for completely different reasons. Originally, Congress wasn't trying to protect famous landmarks. It was trying to prevent another Cairo, another experiment, another building that frightened the public, another fire that firefighters couldn't reach. Fear wrote the law, not symbolism. Over time, however, the explanation changed. As Washington became the political heart of America, people began attaching deeper meaning to its appearance. They admired the open skyline, the uninterrupted views, the clear sightlines toward the Capitol, the White House, and the Washington Monument. Eventually, a new story replaced the old one. People stopped talking about engineering. They stopped talking about fire safety. Instead, they said the skyline was protected out of respect. It was a better story, a more inspiring one. And like many good stories, it survived because it sounded true, not because it actually was. Today, millions of visitors walk through Washington believing they're looking at a city designed around monuments. In reality, they're looking at a city shaped by public fear, political compromise, and one apartment building that caused a national controversy more than a century ago. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even after 130 years, the debate still isn't over, because every few years, someone asks the same question: should Washington finally build upward, or should it remain exactly as it is? And the answer is far more complicated than most people realize. Today, more than a century after Congress passed the Height Act, Washington still looks almost exactly the way lawmakers imagined it. The skyline remains low. The monuments still dominate the horizon. And unlike almost every other capital city, the government, not business, is still the tallest thing in sight. But preserving that skyline has come with a price. Washington never stopped growing. It simply couldn't grow upward, so it grew outward instead. Developers who couldn't build taller buildings had only one option: build wider ones. Entire city blocks became office buildings. Hotels stretched across enormous footprints. Underground parking garages expanded several stories below street level. Every square foot became more valuable, because when height is limited, land becomes expensive. Really expensive, and eventually, many companies made a different decision. If they couldn't build higher in Washington, they would build somewhere else. Cross the Potomac River into Arlington, Virginia. And suddenly, the skyline changes completely. Glass towers begin appearing. Modern office buildings rise into the air. Construction cranes become a common sight. The contrast is almost surreal. You can stand in Washington, look across the river, and see the skyline that the capital itself was never allowed to build. The same thing happened in parts of Bethesda, Maryland, and other nearby cities. The region kept growing. The skyscrapers simply grew outside the city limits. Ironically, the law that protected Washington's skyline may have helped create entirely new skylines around it. Which raises an interesting question. Was the law a mistake? For decades, politicians, architects, economists, and urban planners have argued over exactly that. Some believe Washington should finally modernize, allow taller buildings, increase housing, create more office space, reduce costs. Others argue the opposite, that Washington's low skyline is one of the most recognizable cityscapes in the world, that once skyscrapers arrive, the city loses something impossible to rebuild: its openness, its symmetry, its identity. Even today, Congress occasionally reviews the Height Act. Experts publish reports, committees hold hearings, developers propose changes, but every time the debate returns, so does the same question. How much of a city's identity is worth protecting? Because once a skyline changes, it almost never changes back. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of this entire story. Washington isn't frozen in time because engineers couldn't build skyscrapers. They absolutely could. It isn't because the ground is too weak. It isn't because airplanes fly overhead. And it isn't because of the Washington Monument. It's because over a century ago, one apartment building scared an entire city. That fear became a law. The law became tradition. And tradition became something millions of people now mistake for history. The next time you see a photograph of Washington, D.C., look at the skyline again. You'll notice something most people never do. The tallest structures aren't office towers. They're symbols: the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. Not because the city couldn't build higher, but because more than 130 years ago, it chose not to. And that single decision still shapes the capital of the United States every single day.